of class. Well, the first 2 weeks of Practice Evangelism, we talked about sharing your testimony. In the last 2 weeks, we practiced sharing Jesus without fear. Well, the fifth lesson is about your recovery testimony. And we have that. And our recovery testimony is from the time we got saved up until now. Between that time is how Jesus has helped transform us to be like Him. And for us to understand that, we're going to be looking at 4 passages today. So if you guys would like to flip to them, here they are. First one is 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. Exodus 3. Actually, Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. And Luke chapter 22, verse 42. Okay, so yes, if you have 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, go ahead and read that.
But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me.
Okay. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. Thank you, Nicole. All right. Exodus chapter 3, verse 1.
Now Moses was standing in front of Jethro. Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert, and they came to Horeb, the mountain of God.
Okay. And Luke 22, verse 42.
Say, Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Now, on through sharing your recovery testimony. The first thing is, and this is the first one you will fill the blank in, going through challenges of life, it increases our trust in God. And the 4 passages are example of that. Stephen read 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. And the example is Paul. From Paul's letters, we know what he went through to church plant. He was beaten, he was whipped, he was stoned. Yet that did not stop him from sharing the gospel. In fact, it motivated him even more because it was not about Paul, it was about Christ. And Paul had a recovery testimony on his road to Damascus. Second person, in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, it was Joseph. If you remember, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. And through that, he was able to come across through Potiphar. He was able to come across to the jailer. And in the jail, he met the Pharaoh's cupbearer and the bakery. And that led Joseph into meeting the Pharaoh to interpret his dream. So Joseph went from serving in the prison cell to pretty much being the second person in charge of Egypt, just like God told him early in his life that he would be a ruler. So Joseph is another example of a recovery testimony. The next one in Exodus chapter 3 was Moses. Moses began early in his life of having the best of the best. He lived in the Egyptian palace, but he ran away from God out into the desert. Yet when God was ready to call him to bring his people back out of Egypt, he called Moses, and God transformed Moses. And Moses also has a recovery testimony. Next person is Jesus. And Noah read Luke chapter 22, verse 42, and Jesus saying, Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. Jesus went through the ultimate challenge. He surrendered all of his heavenly glory. He came to this earth, and he lived as a man for 33 years. In the last 3 of those, his ministry launched, and he carried out his Father's will. And his Father's will was to be the perfect sacrifice to redeem mankind. And Jesus went through that challenge. So you can see through the examples on how God used his challenges to bring into people's lives so that we can have a deeper trust in him. And that's why it's important for us to share our recovery testimony with others. Our recovery testimony. What is a recovery testimony? If you go down the list, first thing is, it is not being afraid to admit our struggles from the past and be able to use that to lead people to eternal life. Example of that is Genesis chapter 15, verse 20. Now, if you remember on how Joseph, when he was in Egypt, he was accused for a crime that he did not commit. He was thrown into jail. But God used those struggles to deepen Joseph's trust in him. And Joseph was not ashamed of what he went through, because later on, he revealed it to his brothers and explained to him, because you sold me in jail, that God used so that he may preserve our family, because his brothers went down to survive from a severe famine. And last night, Pastor King answered a question of a person who's struggling of their sins past. Satan will try to use the past sins of yours to hinder you. But we are not identified by what we do, but we are identified in who we are. And that's have a relationship with Christ. And that's very important for us to remember. As you guys begin to share your testimony more and more, you're going to come across in sharing your recovery testimony on how Jesus changed Christina, how Jesus changed Stephen, how Jesus changed James, how Jesus changed Benjamin, how Jesus changed Noah, and how Jesus changed Nicole. James shared his story of his testimony that once he was an artist and he had all the things of the world and all that stuff was taken from him, and it brought to a point to where he wanted to end his life. Yet he called upon God, and God saved him. And James has that unique story because there's a lot of people that hit rock bottom in their lives, and they can relate to James. Now, how to prepare a recovery testimony? How to prepare a recovery testimony? Well, there are 4 things. 4 things. A, my life seemed normal until you explain a discouraged time in your life. You explain a discouraged time in your life. Now, how many of us have been discouraged? I've been discouraged. take yourself back to when you were discouraged. And you remember what it was like. And you remember how God delivered. And that's your testimony. That's your story. Next one. I discover a hope and help in Jesus when, and this is where you explain how God intervened. How did God intervene? For example, in 2006, I had a pickup truck, a 1990 Nissan pickup truck. And it was having mechanical problems. It had problems with its engine. And the engine shut down completely when I was driving. And I kind of had to leave my truck. And I had to walk a little bit. And I had to call people. During that time, I was definitely talking to God. I was like, okay, God, I don't trust in you, but I really need you. I need an automobile. God, please help me. I need my automobile so I can work. Well, God answered that. And He was able to provide for me to take care of my vehicle. Now, sharing that story with someone today is good because there are some people that are struggling with an automobile. And them seeing how God intervened in my life encourages them. Now, you guys have different testimonies, and review and see when was the time that you struggled and how did God intervene. And how did God intervene let you connect with people and let people see God working in you. Next one. I am glad I have a personal relationship with Jesus because this is where we brag on Jesus and how He changed our life. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. Paul was telling us on what he was going through. But the things that he was going through was not about him, but it was about Christ and sharing it with others. And we need to understand that when bad circumstance happens, it's not about us and how we feel about it later. Yet it's about on how Jesus came through. So later we could brag about Him. Fourth part. May I share something like this can happen to you? May I share how something like this can happen to you? That question right there, that's a good question. I will circle that. May I share how something like this can happen to you? What this question does, it tells people on how you were led into the trouble spot. Now, sometimes it's not our fault how we got into a trouble spot. Others time it is. And you can tell people, say, hey, you know what? I was hooked on something. This is how it began. And this is where it brought me to. And people will listen and see, and okay, that's how I can avoid that. And you help that person avoid that trouble spot. So that's the reason why it's a good question. And then you could tell them, again, it was not I that defeated my addiction, but it was when I had a relationship with Christ. When Christ came into my life, He transformed me. He gave me the power to overcome it. Now, that did not mean that I immediately came over my addiction. Christ, it took time. Yet I did overcome. And people could see then how Christ changed someone. Now, and that's how we build a bridge